Dakota Territory, August 1883. Ilera O'Connell stood over a steaming pit of caustic white paste, her face shielded from the heat by a worn linen scarf. Around her, the raw timber frame of her new home baked in the prairie sun. But she wasn't working on the roof or the floorboards. She was stirring a foul-smelling concoction in a barrel, adding handfuls of coarse, dark fibers. They were scraps from the farrier, the clippings and combings from dozens of horses. To her neighbors, it was filth. It was waste. To Ilera, it was the key to survival. Silas Blackwood, the settlement's most respected carpenter, stopped his wagon on the path. He had built half the homes in their small, hopeful valley. He watched her for a long moment, his face a mask of professional confusion. He saw her scoop the hairy muck onto a hawk and begin to trowel it between the laths of her interior walls. The sight was absurd. It was primitive. It was wrong. He called out, his voice carrying easily in the still air, "Ilera, what devilry is that? You're packing your walls with stable sweepings." The few men helping her husband, Liam, frame the porch roof paused, their hammers silent. They looked from Silas to Ilera, a shared smirk passing between them. They called her project Ilera's Hairy Walls. She did not falter. She pressed the thick plaster into the gaps, the dark horsehair clearly visible, like veins in pale flesh. This strange Irish woman, with her quiet ways and her old-world ideas, was building a house that defied every bit of modern frontier sense. She was building a house designed not just to stand, but to breathe. What did this woman, a stonemason's daughter from a land of damp castles, understand about the dry, killing cold of a Dakota winter that every experienced pioneer had missed? What secret was she mixing into her walls with nothing more than lime, sand, and horsehair? Stay with me, and you'll find out why her methods were mocked relentlessly, until the single coldest winter in living memory arrived to reveal the profound and life-saving physics she had embedded in her home. If you believe forgotten wisdom holds real power, hit that subscribe button right now and join us on this journey. The problem in this part of the world was not just the cold. It was a vicious partnership between cold and moisture. The settlers built their cabins tight, using the best timber they could freight in. They chinked the logs with mud and moss, or for those with a bit more means, they built framed houses with clapboard siding. These houses were marvels of frontier ingenuity, raised from the unforgiving soil by sheer will. They were strong, they were sturdy, but they were also coffins waiting for winter. The construction was based on a simple and fatally flawed principle. Keep the cold out. The walls were sealed as tightly as possible. Glass windows, a costly luxury. Doors were caulked with pitch. Heavy wooden doors were weather-stripped with precious felt. The goal was to create an impenetrable barrier against the howling wind and the sub-zero temperatures. Inside, a cast-iron stove was the ravenous heart of the home. It had to be fed constantly, day and night. A family's entire autumn was spent felling, splitting, and stacking a mountain of cordwood that would be systematically devoured by February. But the enemy was already inside. Every breath the family took released a plume of warm, moist air. Every pot of boiling stew, every kettle for tea, every basin of wash water filled the interior space with vapor. In a tightly sealed cabin, this moisture had nowhere to go. It migrated to the coldest surfaces it could find, the single-pane glass of the windows, and the interior face of the exterior walls. On the windows it painted delicate, beautiful ferns of frost, a picturesque lie that spoke of a deeper sickness in the house. On the walls, the problem was more insidious. The moisture condensed, sometimes invisibly, soaking into the wood and the primitive plaster some used. This dampness was a thief. Water is a brutally efficient conductor of heat, far more so than dry wood or air. A damp wall would suck the warmth out of a room 25 times faster than a dry one. The settlers felt this as a constant, bone-deep chill, even when the stove was roaring hot. They would move their beds away from the exterior walls. They would wake to find a rime of frost on their sleeping blankets, where their own breath had frozen during the night. The air grew stale and heavy, thick with the smells of wood smoke, cooking, and unvented humanity. It was a haven for sickness. A persistent cough was the winter's constant song, especially among the children. Elara O'Connell knew this dampness intimately. She had not come from the dry plains of America, but from the green, perpetually weeping hills of County Clare, Ireland. She was the daughter of a stonemason, a man who had spent his life repairing and maintaining stone structures that had stood for 500 years. As a girl, she had not played with dolls. She had played with trowels and sand. Her father had taught her the ancient chemistry of lime. He showed her how limestone, when burned in a kiln, transformed into quicklime. He taught her the dangerous respect this material demanded, how it would burn flesh if handled carelessly, and how, when slaked with water, it would hiss and boil with an exothermic fury, releasing clouds of steam as it became a smooth, buttery lime putty. Section. He had taught her that a wall was not a barrier. A wall, he said, must be a membrane. It had to live and breathe with the seasons, just as a person did. The great stone churches and castles of her homeland were not sealed tombs. They were dynamic systems for managing moisture. They survived for centuries, not by fighting the damp, but by accommodating it, by breathing it in and breathing it out. When she and Liam had arrived in Dakota and spent their first winter in a standard settler's cabin, she saw the familiar enemy. She saw the frost on the walls, felt the gnawing damp in the air. She heard it in the shallow, wet coughs of her two small children, Finn and Maeve. While her neighbors blamed the harshness of the climate, Elara blamed the arrogance of the architecture. Their cabins were built with green, unseasoned lumber because that was all that was available. This wood was swollen with sap and water. As the stove dried the interior air, the wood began to shrink, twist, and warp. The rigid, brittle plaster that some affluent settlers used, made with modern gypsum, couldn't handle this movement. Hairline cracks would appear, then widen, becoming superhighways for drafts. The chinking between logs would crumble and fall out. The house was tearing itself apart from the inside out. Liam, a good man who trusted his wife's uncommon knowledge, agreed. They would not build like the others. They would build a house that remembered the old ways. They would build a house that could breathe. Their plan began not with timber, but with stone. They spent weeks gathering field stones for a proper foundation, setting them in a thick mortar of lime and sand. Then the frame went up, standard in its dimensions, but that was where the similarities to their neighbors' homes ended. The build itself became a piece of local theater. The first strange act was the lime pit. Elara had Liam dig a shallow pit, line it with planks, and into this she shoveled the quicklime she'd had freighted in at great expense. When she added the water, the eruption of steam and furious boiling sent onlookers scattering. They thought the ground itself was erupting. This was the slaking, the violent birth of her lime putty. She would leave it to cure in the pit for 3 months, covering it with sand and planks, letting it mature into a material with sublime plasticity. Silas Blackwood watched this process with a raised eyebrow. He understood lime mortar for foundations, of course, but the sheer quantity she was preparing was baffling. It was inefficient. Gypsum plaster could be bought in bags, mixed, and applied in a day. It set hard and fast. Elara's method was slow, laborious, and to his mind, archaic. The next act was the horsehair. Every time the farrier came through the settlement, Elara was there, gathering the discarded clippings. She washed the hair, separating the long, strong tail and mane hairs. Then she left them to soak in lime-washed water for weeks. This drew open mockery. Children would run past their homestead yelling, "Don't let your pony get too close. Elara will shave it for her walls." Women at the trading post would whisper about her. Was it some form of witchcraft? Some pagan ritual from the old country? Silas confronted her one afternoon as she was mixing her first batch of plaster. He was not a cruel man. He was a concerned professional. He represented the voice of established, hard-won frontier wisdom. His expertise was real, earned through a dozen brutal winters. He had built the church that stood strong against the wind. He had framed the barn that kept the community's livestock alive. His words carried immense weight. "Elara," he began, his tone patient, "I have to ask what you're doing. That hair, it's organic material. In a year, it will begin to rot inside your walls. It will smell. Worse, it will create hollows. Your plaster will be weak, like a honeycomb. It will crumble." His argument was technically specific, and it sounded entirely plausible. It was based on sound principles of building science as he knew it. The other men working on the house stopped to listen. This was the expert delivering his verdict. Elara wiped a smear of white paste from her brow with the back of her forearm. She looked at Silas, her eyes clear and steady. She did not offer a complex defense. She did not argue physics. "In my father's country, there are plaster walls with horsehair in them that have not crumbled in 300 years, she said simply. "The lime protects the hair." Her response was so plain, so devoid of technical jargon, that it sounded like folklore. It sounded like a dismissal. Silas shook his head, a look of pity on his face. "This isn't your father's country, Elara. The cold here is different. It's a predator. It will find every weakness. You are building a weakness into the very heart of your home." He walked away, and with him went any remaining confidence the other settlers had in the O'Connell project. From that day on, Liam found it harder to get help from his neighbors. The project was now officially known as Elara's Folly. Undeterred, they pressed on. The system Elara was building was a 3-part harmony of materials. The first layer, applied directly to the hand-split wooden laths, was the scratch coat. This was the hairiest mix, a coarse plaster with the longest, strongest horsehairs. Elara troweled it on thick, about a half-inch, and then, before it set, she used a small rake to score its surface with deep horizontal grooves. This layer was the skeleton. The horsehair was not just a random filler, it was a three-dimensional matrix of tensile strength. Wood moves, it shrinks, it swells, it twists. A rigid plaster would fight this movement and inevitably crack. But Alara's plaster was different. The millions of tiny interlocking fibers gave it flexibility. When the wood frame shifted, the plaster would give, held together by its hairy web. It could bend where others would break. The deep scratches were there to provide a mechanical key for the next layer to grip onto. After the scratch coat was allowed to cure slowly for 2 weeks, she applied the second layer, the brown coat or floating coat. This mix had less hair, and the hairs were shorter. Its purpose was to create a perfectly flat, even surface over the rougher first coat. This was the layer of precision where she and Liam used long, straight-edged pieces of wood to screed the walls, ensuring they were plumb and true. This layer was nearly 3/4 of an inch thick. It was the thermal mass of the system. Finally, after another month of slow curing, came the finish coat. This was a gossamer thin layer, no more than 1/8 of an inch thick. It contained no hair at all, just the finest slaked lime putty and clean sifted sand. She applied it with a steel trowel, polishing the surface until it was as smooth and cool as marble. The complete system was a wall nearly 1.5 inches thick, but its genius was not in its thickness. It was in its chemistry and physics. The finished wall was a lung. Lime plaster is inherently hygroscopic, meaning it attracts and holds water molecules. When the air inside the house was humid, from cooking, from breathing, the lime plaster walls would literally absorb that moisture out of the air, holding it within their microporous structure. Then, when the air became dry, when the stove was burning hot and no one was cooking, the walls would slowly release that stored moisture back into the room. The system was a massive, passive humidity regulator. It prevented the wild swings in humidity that caused sickness and destroyed the very structure of the house. The horsehair provided the structural integrity to allow this process to happen year after year, decade after decade, without the wall cracking and failing. It was not a barrier, it was a buffer. Alara hadn't built a wall, she had built an engine designed to manage the interior climate. By the time October arrived, the house was finished. From the outside, it looked like any other framed house in the valley. But inside, the air felt different. It was fresh. There was a clean mineral smell, like a cave after a rainstorm. The walls were a soft, luminous white, cool to the touch. The folly was complete. Now, all it had to do was face the winter. The winter began with a deceptive mildness. November was crisp and clear. The settlers of the valley felt a cautious optimism. Perhaps this year would be a reprieve. They had their firewood stacked high, their larders full. Alara's house was performing well. The air remained comfortable, and their firewood consumption seemed, anecdotally, to be lower than in their previous cabin. But this was the quiet before the storm. It was a test any decent house could pass. Then December came. It arrived not as a gentle snow, but as an invading army from the north. The sky turned a bruised, metallic gray. The temperature, which had been a tolerable 20 degrees Fahrenheit at dawn, plummeted. By noon, it was 0. By sunset, it read -15, and the wind had begun to pick up. The old-timers, the ones who had been in the territory for 20 years, looked at the sky and felt a primal dread. They recognized the signs. This was not a normal cold front. This was a white hurricane, a prairie blizzard of historic proportions. For 3 days the world vanished. There was no sky, no ground, only a churning horizontal chaos of wind and ice. The wind did not howl. It screamed, a constant high-pitched shriek that frayed the nerves and made sleep impossible. Snow, driven with the force of sandblasting, piled in drifts that buried fences, then sheds, then entire sides of houses. Inside the conventional cabins, the battle for survival began in earnest. The tightly sealed walls, once a source of pride, now became instruments of torture. The temperature differential between the roaring stove and the exterior walls was extreme, sometimes over 100 degrees. The green lumber frames contracted violently in the brutal cold. This was the moment of failure. The settlers heard it as sharp, cracking sounds in the night, like a pistol shot. It was the sound of their modern gypsum plaster giving up. Spiderweb cracks would erupt across the walls, instantly becoming icy fissures that poured cold air into the room. The chinking in the log cabins froze solid and was blasted out by the pressure changes from the wind, leaving gaping holes. The interior humidity, with nowhere to go, condensed on these failing walls, coating them in a layer of frost that grew thicker by the hour. This frost acted like a sponge for the stove's heat, sucking it out of the room. The cabins were now actively fighting their inhabitants. Families burned through their firewood at a terrifying rate. A week's supply was gone in 2 days. They started burning fence posts, then furniture. The interiors of the homes became small, desperate circles of shivering humanity huddled around the stove, while just a few feet away the walls were literally freezing over. Livestock, trapped in barns that were no match for the wind, began to perish. The temperature outside dropped to 30 below, then 40 below, not factoring in a wind chill that was simply unsurvivable. Silas Blackwood, the master carpenter, found himself in a house of his own design and construction, and it was failing him. He had built it for his family, with the best materials and techniques he knew. He had used expensive, milled lumber and caulked every seam. But on the second night of the blizzard, a loud crack echoed through his home. A vertical fissure appeared in the wall above his stone fireplace, a monument to his craftsmanship, now marred by a scar of failure. A constant, needle-thin stream of frigid air flowed from it. Despite feeding his stove until it glowed cherry red, the temperature in the room struggled to stay above freezing. His wife and children were bundled in every blanket they owned, their faces pale and drawn. His expertise was useless. His certainty had become his prison. He had built a rigid, unyielding box, and the immense power of the cold had simply broken it. And in his fear and frustration, a single thought began to haunt him. Ilara O'Connell, the woman with the hairy walls, the fool. He pictured her and her family, their cabin surely compromised, the rotting horsehair having created 1,000 points of failure. He imagined the damp walls freezing solid, the plaster crumbling away, leaving them exposed. The thought was a spike of guilt in his gut. He had mocked her. He had stood by while a woman, in her ignorance, had potentially built a tomb for her children. On the 4th day, the wind finally subsided. The snow stopped, and a natural crystalline silence fell over the valley. The world was a blanket of white under a pale, indifferent sun. The temperature, however, did not rise. It settled at a steady, lethal 42 degrees below zero. This was the most dangerous time. The violence of the storm was over, but the killing cold remained. Silas knew he had to go. It was a duty. He had to check on the O'Connells. He bundled himself in layers of wool and oilskin, pulled on his thickest mittens, and wrapped a scarf around his face until only his eyes were visible. The short walk to their homestead, normally a 10-minute stroll, became a brutal Arctic expedition. The snow was waist-deep, a fine powder that offered no purchase. Every step was a struggle. The air was so cold, it felt like a physical substance, searing his lungs with each breath. His own breath froze instantly on his scarf, creating a cage of ice around his mouth. He was a man of immense physical strength, but by the time he saw their cabin, he was exhausted, the cold beginning to leach the strength from his limbs. He saw no signs of disaster. The cabin stood perfectly intact, snow piled high against its north side. But there was no smoke coming from the chimney. His heart sank. That was the sign of ultimate failure. They had run out of wood. They were frozen. He stumbled the last few yards to the door, his mind racing with what horrors he might find inside. He raised a heavy, mittened hand and knocked. The sound was flat and dead in the frozen air. He waited. Nothing. He knocked again, harder this time, shouting her name, his voice muffled by his frozen scarf. He heard a faint stirring inside, then the sound of the latch being drawn. The door swung inward. It was not a wave of cold that met him. It was a wall of warmth, a dense, enveloping, impossible warmth. It was so shocking, so contrary to every law of physics as he understood it in that moment, that he physically staggered back. The air that flowed out of the cabin was not just warm, it was fresh and alive. It smelled of baking bread and clean linen. Elara stood in the doorway, holding her youngest, Maeve, on her hip. The child was wearing only a simple woolen dress. Elara herself had her sleeves rolled up to her elbows, a dusting of flour on her forearms. She looked at him, her expression one of mild surprise, not distress. "Silas," she said, her voice calm, "come in out of the cold. You look frozen through." He stepped across the threshold, and it felt like crossing from one world into another. He pulled the scarf from his face, his frozen beard crackling. He blinked, his eyes adjusting to the soft light inside. What he saw defied belief. It was a scene of complete, utter, domestic normalcy. Liam sat in a chair by the window, reading a book, a mug of steaming tea at his elbow. He was in his shirt sleeves. Their son, Finn, was on the floor barefoot, playing with a set of carved wooden animals. There was no frost on the windows. There was no frantic energy. It was an island of summer in the heart of a frozen hell. Silas stood there, mute, a statue of frozen wool and disbelief. His professional mind, the mind of a builder, began to race, trying to reconcile the data. The first thing he checked was the fire. He looked at the stove. It was not glowing red-hot. It was burning with a low, steady flame. A small fire, a ridiculously small fire for a day like this. Then he looked at the walls. He walked over to the north wall, the one that had borne the brunt of the blizzard's fury. He pressed his bare palm against its smooth, white surface. He was expecting to feel the biting cold of the exterior. He was expecting it to be damp. It was neither. The wall felt cool, but not cold. It felt completely, utterly dry. He ran his hand over it, searching for the cracks that must be there. He found none, not a single hairline fracture. The surface was a continuous, unbroken plane of plaster. It was perfect. He turned back to Alara, his voice a hoarse whisper. "How?" "The walls," she said, as if it were the simplest thing in the world. But it wasn't simple to him. It was magic. His mind, trained in the logic of wood and nails and heat and cold, was short-circuiting. He needed numbers. He needed data to make sense of the miracle he was witnessing. "Your wood pile," he said, his voice urgent. "How much wood have you burned?" Liam looked up from his book. "We brought in what we thought was a 4-day supply when the storm hit. We have more than half of it left." The number landed on Silas like a physical blow. More than half. He had burned through a week's supply in 3 days, and his house was still dangerously cold. They had used less than a quarter of the fuel he had, and their home was a sanctuary of warmth. He did the mental math. Their house was, by some impossible metric, at least 4 times more efficient than his own. He looked around the room, his builder's eye taking in every detail. He saw the lack of condensation, the comfortable children, the small fire. He saw the evidence of a system working in perfect harmony with its environment, not fighting a losing battle against it. He walked back to the wall and placed his hand on it again. He finally understood. The wall wasn't just a barrier. It was a battery, a thermal and moisture battery. It had absorbed the stove's moderate heat and was now radiating it back into the room slowly and evenly. It had absorbed the moisture from their breathing and cooking, keeping the air dry and easy to heat. The horsehair was the hidden skeleton, holding it all together, giving it the flexible strength to endure the contraction of the wood frame. Everything he had predicted had been wrong. The hair had not rotted. The plaster had not crumbled. The wall had not become a source of weakness. It had become the source of their salvation. He turned to face Alara. The arrogance and pity he had felt for her were gone, replaced by a profound and humbling awe. He looked at this quiet woman, whom he had dismissed as a foolish immigrant clinging to outdated traditions, and he saw her not as a fool, but as a master. He drew a deep breath. The words were hard, but they were necessary. They were the only honorable response to the undeniable truth laid bare in that warm, safe room. "Ilara," he said, and his voice was thick with the emotion of a man whose entire worldview has just been shattered and rebuilt. "I was wrong. This works. You have to teach me how." In that moment, the mockery of Alara's folly died forever. When the great blizzard of 1883 finally broke, the valley emerged into a changed world. The official temperature had bottomed out at -47 degrees, a record that would stand for 50 years. The cost had been immense. Dozens of livestock had perished. Several families had suffered from severe frostbite. The community was shaken, humbled by the raw power of the climate. But as people began to venture out, a story started to spread. It began with Silas Blackwood. He did not whisper it. He proclaimed it. He told everyone who would listen about the warm cabin. He described the barefoot children, the small fire, the complete absence of frost or cracks. Coming from any other man, it might have been dismissed as an exaggeration, but this was Silas, the man who built their world. His word was as solid as oak. His conversion was total and immediate. He became Alara's most fervent advocate. He brought other men to her house, not to gawk, but to learn. He would have them place their hands on the walls, just as he had, and witness the impossible reality. He explained the principles as best he could, translating Ilara's quiet, practical wisdom into a language the other builders could understand. The derisive nickname Ilara's Folly was recontextualized. It was now said with a tone of respect, a testament to the community's own short-sightedness. The innovation began to spread. The following spring, no new house was built without first consulting Ilara O'Connell. She never positioned herself as an expert. She was simply a teacher. She showed them how to slake the lime, how to wash and prepare the hair, how to mix the plaster in the correct ratios for each of the 3 coats. She shared her knowledge freely, without any expectation of payment or fame. Her reward was seeing her neighbors build safer, healthier homes for their children. Silas Blackwood was her first true student. That summer, he painstakingly stripped the cracked gypsum plaster from his own house, a profound act of humility. He then replastered his entire home using Ilara's method, working under her quiet guidance. The following winter, his family lived in the same warmth and comfort he had witnessed in her cabin. The adoption of the method transformed the community. The visible impact was in the health of the people. The persistent winter cough that had plagued the children became a rarity. Families were no longer confined to a small circle around the stove. They could use their entire homes all winter long. The psychological impact was just as significant. The gnawing background dread of winter lessened. The houses felt less like fragile shelters and more like steadfast partners in survival. The true impact wasn't measured in degrees on a thermometer or in cords of wood saved. It was measured in human dignity. It was measured in a baby surviving its first winter without sickness. It was measured in a family being able to sit down for a meal without wearing 3 layers of clothing. It was measured in the quiet confidence that came from living within a structure that worked with nature, not against it. Ilara's method, born of ancient knowledge, had given the community a foothold in one of the harshest environments on the continent. The story of Ilara's hairy walls serves as a powerful reminder. It shows how innovation is often a rediscovery of forgotten wisdom. Tradition is not always an obstacle to progress. Sometimes it is the very source of it. The settlers, in their rush to embrace modern materials like fast-setting gypsum, had overlooked the genius of a system perfected over centuries. They dismissed what they didn't understand, mistaking a slow, deliberate process for an inefficient one. It took the undeniable empirical evidence of a crisis, a house that stood warm and strong when all others failed, to shatter their preconceptions. The physics of fiber-reinforced lime plaster are not magic. The principles Ilara O'Connell understood are now being rediscovered in modern sustainable architecture. We call them hygroscopic building materials and passive humidity control. We talk about the importance of tensile strength in composite materials. What Ilara knew as craft, we now describe with complex engineering terms, but the fundamental truth remains the same. A wall that can breathe is a wall that can last. If this story of forgotten knowledge made you think, hit that like button. And subscribe to this channel for more stories of the incredible ingenuity our ancestors used to survive and thrive in a world without our modern conveniences. What is the coldest winter you have ever personally faced? Drop a comment below and tell us your story. The story you have just heard is a fictionalized account, created to illustrate real-world historical engineering and construction principles in a compelling narrative format. The characters, names, and specific events are products of imagination. However, the techniques described, the use of slaked lime plaster with horsehair as a fiber reinforcement to manage humidity and resist cracking in wood frame structures, are based on real historical practices that were used for centuries. This content is for educational and entertainment purposes only and does not constitute professional building or engineering advice.